I'm repeating a series that I did a few years ago called The Bible in 20 C's. And I said last week that even though this material is not new to some of you, I pray that it will be fresh. I'm going to be adding a lot of stuff that we didn't have include last time. And so I hope it'll be fresh to you. And I hope it'll help you. This is one of those type of things that we just need to hear over and over again every few years. And I especially wanted to do this for the benefit of our new folks. This is a bird's eye view of the Bible from beginning to end. Now here's what we're doing. We are looking at the Bible from Genesis to Revelation in 20 major sections or categories. And they all begin with the letter C. For example, right now we're talking about creation. When we get to the fall of man, we'll talk about corruption. When we get to the Tower of Babel, we'll talk about confusion. And on and on and on, until we get all the way to the book of Revelation, and we'll talk about consummation. So we're going through the entire Bible using the method of the 20 C's. Now, this is the second lesson that we've done on the subject of creation. And I don't want to take a long time to review tonight. So let me just kind of read, and if you have a handout and you didn't fill in all the blanks last week, if you didn't bring yours back, then you can just kind of fill them in as we go along. Notice what it says in Genesis 1:1. We're going to jump right into it tonight. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw the light that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness He called night. And the evening and the morning were the first day. Let me just remind you of what I said last week. God created light before He created the sun. We think of the sun and we think of light as being synonymous. God created the light, and He didn't create the sun until the fourth day. You say, how is that possible? He's God. And God is the light. And I said last week, there's coming a day in the New Jerusalem where the Bible says there'll be no need of the sun in the New Jerusalem because Jesus is the light. So God created the light before He created the sun. All right, let's keep reading. And God said, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. And God made the firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament, and it was so. And God called the firmament heaven, and the evening and the morning were the second day." And we said last time that this firmament was a canopy of water that surrounded the earth. It was in the atmosphere, and it was a canopy of water that surrounded the earth. And it is no longer there. Many Bible scholars believe that God allowed that canopy to be let loose during the flood of Noah, and that's one of the things that caused it to rain for 40 days and 40 nights. In addition to the fact that the Bible says the fountains of the deep broke forth. And many Bible scholars believe there were underground oceans. There was actually 2 layers of oceans at that time, one above the ground, one beneath the ground. And the fountains of the deep broke forth, the canopy let loose, and the entire earth was covered with water. Now that canopy of water that used to surround the earth created a greenhouse effect, so that the earth had a tropical climate from pole to pole. From the North Pole to the South Pole, it created a tropical climate. This allowed men and women to live for hundreds of years for several reasons. First of all, because of this canopy of water, the atmospheric pressure would have been double what it is today. Secondly, the oxygen level in the air that we breathe would have been double what it is today. Thirdly, that canopy of water would have filtered many of the harmful ultraviolet rays that cause many problems for us today. And then also men lived hundreds of years because they were so much closer to the original. There was less opportunity for genetic defects. And we said that with every successive generation since Adam, after sin entered into the world and death by sin and disease, there's been more opportunities for genetic defects, but they were so close to the original that because of that and because of the canopy, men lived hundreds of years. The oldest man recorded in the Bible was Methuselah. Does anybody remember how long Methuselah lived? Just holler it out. 969 years. And so that was the second day, the firmament. Notice what happened on the third day. Verse 9. And God said, "Let the waters under the heaven be gathered together unto one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of waters called He seas. And God saw that it was good. And God said, let the earth bring forth grass, the herb yielding seed, and the fruit tree yielding fruit after his kind, whose seed is in itself upon the earth. And it was so. And the earth brought forth grass and herb yielding seed after his kind, and the tree yielding fruit, whose seed was in itself after his kind. And God saw that it was good. And the evening and the morning were the third day. All right, now we said last time that this is exactly the opposite of what evolution teaches. Evolution teaches that life began in the waters. The Bible teaches that the first life that existed on earth was created by God on dry land. And so we're taking a few minutes, or taking a little time to talk about creation versus evolution. Now, the things that I'm giving you now concerning evolution are not in your notes, so you'll have to write these things down independently of your fill-in-the-blank outline if you're taking notes. Let me just begin this section tonight by saying this. Are you listening tonight? Okay, everybody listen, draw up close and listen. Okay, here's the deal. Evolution is not good science. You do not have to reject evolution strictly on theological grounds. Now, I do reject the theory of evolution on theological grounds. For one thing, it reduces Adam to the level of a spiritually transformed ape. So I do reject evolution on a lot of theological grounds, but you do not have to reject evolution solely on theological grounds. The fact is, evolution is not good science. Now, the evolutionist says to the creationist, all you have is faith. Let me make something very clear tonight, and you'll see this as we get into the message. Evolution is a faith-based theory. It is a faith-based theory. What I mean by that is this. When it comes to the matter of origins, none of us were there. Right? Therefore, we have to look at the evidence. And based upon evidence, we have to decide, where do I choose to put my faith? Based on the evidence. In other words, does the evidence indicate that life is the result of an accident and random chance, or does the evidence seem to indicate the existence of a creator designer? In other words, is it more logical, reasonable, rational, and scientific to put my faith in evolution, or is it more rational, reasonable, and scientific to put my faith in the existence of a creator designer? Now, what is the scientific evidence? Well, first of all, let's define evolution. The theory of evolution assumes an upward progression from chaos to complexity. Evolution assumes an upward progression from chaos to complexity. Now, the question that we have to answer is this. Is this observable? Is it observable in the natural world? Is it observable in a laboratory? Well, last week we began talking about bridges that the evolutionists cannot cross. And the first bridge is the origin of life. And I'm going to pick up now right where I left off last week. And I'm going to get now into new material. Now, let me just share with you the theory, the origin of life from an evolutionist perspective. Are you ready? Here we go. Number one, the evolutionist says that about 4.5 billion years ago, there was a large inorganic ocean. Now, they do not attempt to explain where that ocean came from. You have to take that by faith. Somehow, it got there. Secondly, the evolutionist says that out of that inorganic ocean, there somehow formed, now I put somehow in quotes, there somehow formed an amino acid. Now, watch me now. If you ask the evolutionists, how did that amino acid form? Here's the answer you'll get. Well, we're not sure. Now, if you believe that happened, but you don't know how it happened, what do you call that? Faith. We're not sure how it happened, but we believe that it happened, that somehow an amino acid formed. And by the way, no evolutionist has the answer to how that might have happened. Number two, they say, somehow a bunch of amino acids got together and formed by random chance. They got together and formed a protein molecule. Now, the protein molecule is the basic building block of life. And they say somehow the amino acids got together by random choice, by accident. and formed a protein molecule. Now again, if you ask them, well, how did that happen? This is the answer. Well, we're not sure how, but we believe that it happened. And then they say, number 4, somehow by random chance, this non-living matter rose to complexity and became living matter. Now, again, if you ask them, well, how did that happen? The answer is, well, we're not sure. But we believe that that's what happened. Number 5, the 5th step would be this. Somehow, over millions of years, this living matter rose to greater complexity to become conscious matter. Now, again, the key word is somehow. You'll read that a lot in the evolutionary theory. Somehow. Because if you ask him how that could have happened, the answer is, we're not sure. But we believe that it happened. Number 6, somehow, this conscious matter rose to greater and greater complexity to become conscious matter. Again, if you ask them, well, how did that happen? The answer is, we're not sure. But we believe that it happened. And then finally, somehow, number 7, this self-conscious matter developed ethics and values, and that's where we are today. And again, if you ask, well, how did that happen? Here's the answer. You should know it by now. We're not sure, but we believe that it happened. How many of y'all see a huge element of faith involved here? Now, this is why I'm telling you it is a faith-based theory. Listen, from amoeba to astronaut, every step is unexplainable, but somehow it happened. And so the theory of evolution assumes an upward progression from chaos to complexity. Now, please remember this about these 7 things that I just showed you. Please remember this. Not one of these steps, not one of them, has ever been observed in the natural world, nor has it ever been observed in a laboratory. Now, what is the scientific method? You develop a hypothesis. You conduct experiments that are designed to prove your hypothesis, and those experiments should be in repeatable units. Not one of these steps has ever been observed in the natural world, nor has it ever been observed in a laboratory. That's why I say it is a faith-based theory, which they say they have the evidence for. Every once in a while, you will catch an evolutionist in a rare moment of honesty. And they will let you know that the evidence for those 7 steps is very weak at best and really non-existent. For example, one of the leading evolutionists that ever lived was Dr. George Wald. And I gave you this quote last week. Dr. George Wald said this, "When it comes to the origin of life, we have only 2 possibilities as to how life arose. One is spontaneous generation arising to evolution. The other is a supernatural creative act of God. There is no third possibility." So far, so good, right? Spontaneous generation was scientifically disproved 100 years ago by Louis Pasteur, Spallanzani, Reddy, and others. That leads us scientifically, watch now, that leads us scientifically to only one possible conclusion, that life arose as a supernatural creative act of God. So far, so good, right? But now here's what else he said. Here's what he added. "I will not accept that philosophically because I do not want to believe in God. Therefore, I choose to believe in that which I know is scientifically impossible. Spontaneous generation arising to evolution." That was from Scientific American, August 1954. Did you catch what he just said? He said, "I'm going to choose to believe what I know is not true because I will not consider the alternative." The idea of God is off the table. So what does that make evolution? Here's what it makes it. It makes it the next best guess of a mind that chooses to reject God. Sir Arthur Keith was also caught in a rare moment of honesty. He said, and I quote, "Evolution is unproved and improvable. We believe it because the only alternative is special creation, which is unthinkable." Again, he said God is off the table. Therefore, we have to believe what is not provable. D.S. Watson said basically the same thing, another leading evolutionist. He said evolution is a theory universally accepted, not because it can be proven by logically coherent evidence to be true, but because the only alternative, special creation, is clearly incredible. In other words, we've taken God off the table. Therefore, we must believe what we know is not provable. And we must believe what we know is not probable. And so that is the first bridge that the evolutionists cannot cross. The first bridge is the origin of life. All right, now let's take the next step. The second bridge that the evolutionists cannot cross are the laws of biogenesis. Now, what are the laws of biogenesis? The laws of biogenesis simply say that life only arises from life. That it is scientifically impossible to get life from non-living matter. Now, ladies and gentlemen, listen to me tonight. That's not a theory. That's a law. That is observable in the natural world. It is not the theory of biogenesis. It's the law of biogenesis. If you ask the evolutionist, how do you get life from non-living matter? The standard answer is this. You have to believe that it somehow occurred. Now, what do we call that? We call that faith. They have no scientific explanation for how evolution got around what is observable in the natural world. And that is the laws of biogenesis. That life arises only from life. And it is impossible to get life from non-living matter. Let me give you two examples from the area of biochemistry. Number one, I want to talk about the protein metabolic motor. Every living cell, no matter how simple, whether you're talking about plants, animals, or humans, has a complex enzymatic protein metabolic motor. Doesn't that bless your heart? You say, preacher, what does that mean in plain English? Here's what it means. It means that every cell, in order for it to survive, must be able to extract energy from its environment and utilize that energy for the purpose of reproduction and to meet other cell needs. Now, let me repeat that. Every cell that survives must have the ability to draw energy from its environment and then to metabolize that energy, to use that energy for reproduction and to meet other cell needs. Now, here's the riddle. Here's the riddle. How did substances come into being that are absolutely essential to life but can only be produced by life? How did they come into being from non-living, inorganic matter? That is a bridge that the evolutionist cannot cross. The same thing is true about DNA. Now, what is DNA? You've all studied about DNA when you were in school. DNA are those nucleic acids within the molecule that, or within the cell that determine who you are and what you are. Within DNA, there is an intricate code. It is a code that is written much like computer code. And it was your DNA that determined how tall you are, what color your eyes are, what color your hair is. Your DNA determined all that in that it was coded into your DNA when you were conceived. Now, let me tell you something about this code. First of all, Bill Gates said this. Bill Gates said, the code that is written within DNA is more complex than any software program we have ever written. If Charles Darwin had known about DNA, he would have never put forth his theory. Because DNA totally debunked his theory in that it is so complicated and it is so intricate that it could have only come from one source, intelligence. You know, it's one thing for somebody to drop rocks out of an airplane and for those rocks to accidentally fall on the ground and to form what could be conceived as a star. And you say, wow, did you see that? Those rocks fell out of that airplane, and look at how they fell. That kind of looks like a star. Have you ever looked at a cloud and you saw something in the cloud that looked like a dog or an elephant? And you say, wow, look, that's amazing. But if somebody dropped rocks from an airplane, and if those rocks fell in such perfect organizational structure as to say, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish but have everlasting life, then you would have to conclude that there was some intelligence behind that. That didn't happen by random chance. I mean, it's one thing to look at a cloud and say, that kind of looks like an elephant, or that kind of looks like a dog. But when you look at the sky and there are clouds that say, eat at Joe's Diner, then you know those are not clouds. An airplane did that by skywriting, right? There was an intelligence behind that. And when scientists discovered DNA, automatically they knew that it was so intricately written in code that there had to be an intelligence behind it. Matter of fact, I want to read to you how one writer put it, and I want you to follow along. A little lengthy, but I want you to follow it along as I read aloud. Another huge problem for devout evolutionists, which has emerged over the last few years, is the discovery of DNA. DNA would have been an utter mystery to Darwin, and if he had known about it in his day, he may well have revised his teachings. To be frank, DNA does not fit in with evolution. It's as simple as that. Maybe the honest thing would have been for scientists to have jettisoned the theory of evolution there and then. Upon the discovery of DNA, But just think what would have been involved in that. Countless thousands of science teachers and lecturers would have had to be retrained. Countless thousands of scientific textbooks would have had to have been destroyed, and on it goes. Moreover, the scientific establishment would have suffered a massive loss of face. Would anybody ever be prepared to listen to scientists again? This would all have been a virtually impossible undertaking, and the cost to our schools and universities would have been astronomical. So the scientific establishment instead decided to somehow make DNA fit into the theory of evolution. One can't help being reminded of the old proverb, "Oh, what a tangled web we weave when first we set our hearts to deceive." Of course, I am not suggesting that the average scientist wants to deceive. Evolutionary theory is simply the intellectual diet which they have been fed for a long time. How many of you all have ever heard of Sir Fred Hoyle? Sir Fred Hoyle was a brilliant scientist, an astrophysicist from the University of Cambridge. And Sir Fred Hoyle made this amazing statement. He said, and I quote, "Let's be intellectually honest. The probability of life arising by chance is the same probability as throwing a 6 on the dice 5 million consecutive times. The probability of life arising to greater and greater complexity and organization is the same probability as having a tornado tear through a junkyard and form a 747 jet." Now, that's not a Bible thumper saying that. That is a brilliant astrophysicist saying that. Well, what is he saying? He's saying random impersonal chance. Listen, that random impersonal chance does not ever create greater complexity. It always creates greater chaos. The third bridge that the evolutionists cannot cross is the fixity of the species. I want you to look at what it says in Genesis chapter 1, verses 11 and 12. Genesis 1, 11 and 12. "And God said, Let the earth bring forth grass, the herb yielding seed, and the fruit tree yielding fruit after his kind, whose seed is in itself upon the earth. And it was so. And the earth brought forth grass, and herb yielding seed after his kind, and the tree yielding fruit, whose seed was in itself after his kind. And God saw that it was good." Did you notice the phrase that was repeated 3 times? What was it? After his kind. Listen, look this way. It is used 10 times in the creation account. And you may not know it, but it's a very scientific term. Because it has to do with the fixity of the species. The built-in likeness that God has built in every species. Listen, it's the reason that you can crossbreed roses for years. And you will get red roses and yellow roses and white roses. And you will get long stem roses and short stem roses. You will get every kind of rose imaginable, but the one thing you will never get, crossbreeding roses, is a tomato or a puppy. That's because of the fixity of the species. That's because of the built-in likeness. Everything reproduces after his kind. You can get a lot of variation within a species, but the fixity of the species says Everything reproduces after its kind. Now listen carefully. For this reason, there is an attempt on the part of evolutionists to redefine evolution. And here's what they're doing now in many of our textbooks, and you need to know this if your kids go to the public school. They are now equating evolution with natural selection. And it's not the same thing. They are equating microevolution, which is variation within a species, with macroevolution, which is a jump from one species to another. And the first thing they do is they'll show you finches, pictures of finches. And there are finches with long beaks, and finches with short beaks, and finches with medium-sized beaks. And they'll say, there, do you see the evolution? But the point is, they are still finches. They'll show you a Shetland pony, and they'll show you a Clydesdale, and everything in between, and say, there, do you see the evolution? But the point is, they are all still horses. Now, sometimes within a species, it's called horizontal variation or microevolution. But then they make the leap, and it is a leap of faith, make no doubt about it, that because horizontal evolution is true, in other words, evolution within a species, that vertical evolution must also be true, which is evolution between the species. Do you know what the problem with that is? First of all, it has never been observed in the natural world or in the laboratory. Secondly, there are no transitional forms. There is no evidence of one species evolving into another. Darwin said, if my theory is true, the fossil record will bear this out, and there will be millions of transitional forms found in the fossil records. Well, guess what? We have the fossil records, and they're not there. Everything in the fossil record says that these species all appeared suddenly and fully formed, with no transitional ancestry. You say, well, what about the pictures in all the textbooks? You just answered your own question. They're pictures. They're not reality. There are millions and millions of fossils, but no transitional forms. From amoeba to astronaut. They used to say, we must find the missing link, meaning that transitional form. We must find the missing link. You must understand that the theory of evolution is not missing a link. The whole chain is missing. You say, well, what about the cavemen? What about them? There have always been cavemen. There are men that live in caves today. Go to the Middle East. But if you're talking about a half ape, half man, that's a different subject. There's no evidence for that. You say, sure there is. I've seen the pictures. That's exactly right. You've seen pictures. You've seen artist conceptions based on very weak evidence that was almost without exception later disproven. You've heard of Piltdown Man and Nebraska Man. Consider the following article by Pat Buchanan. With publication of On the Origin of the Species in 1859, the hunt was on for the missing link. Fame and fortune awaited the scientists who found the link, proving Darwin right, that man evolved from a monkey. In 1912, success. In a gravel pit near Piltdown in East Sussex, there was found the cranium of a man with the jaw of an ape. Darwin theory proved true, read the banner headline. Evolution skeptics were pilloried, and 3 English scientists were knighted for validating Piltdown Man. It wasn't until 1953, after generations of biology students had been taught about Piltdown Man, that closer inspection discovered that the cranium belonged to a medieval Englishman. The bones had been dyed to look older, and the jaw belonged to an orangutan whose teeth had been filed down to look human. The scientific discovery of the century became the hoax of the century. But Piltdown Man was not alone. There was Nebraska Man. In 1922, Henry Fairfield Osborn, president of the American Museum of Natural History, identified a tooth fossil found in Nebraska to be that of an anthropoid ape. He used his discovery to mock William Jennings Bryan, newly elected to Congress, as the most distinguished primate which the state of Nebraska has yet produced. Invited to testify at the Scopes trial, however, Osborn begged off. For by 1925, Nebraska Man's tooth had been traced to a wild pig. And creationist Duane Gish, a biochemist, had remarked of Osborne's Nebraska man, I believe this is a case in which a scientist made a man out of a pig, and the pig made a monkey out of a scientist. The fourth bridge that the evolutionists cannot cross is the law of entropy, sometimes called the second law of thermodynamics, which simply says that all energy available for work is in the process of running down. This universe is like a wound-up clock that is running down. In other words, everything in the universe, all energy and all matter, is moving, listen, it is moving from a state of organization and complexity to a state of disintegration, chaos, and disorganization. Now that's what's observable in the natural world. When left alone, things run down. When left alone, things fall apart. For example, if you take a new car and if you place that new car out in the elements and leave it for several years, what happens to that new car? It rusts, it decays, and it disintegrates. If you take a beautifully manicured golf course and if you leave it to itself, what happens within a few years? All you have is a field full of weeds. This is a basic law of physics, that everything in the natural world moves from organization to chaos. Now, here's the problem. Here's the problem. That is the opposite of the evolutionary model. What's observable in the real world is the opposite of the evolutionary model. The evolutionary model says everything is moving upward, that everything is moving from a state of disorganization to organization, from chaos to complexity. Carl Sagan said, all you really need is enough time. If you now allow enough time, anything is possible. Time, listen, time is not the friend of the evolutionary theory, it is the enemy. Because given more time, things do not become more organized, they become less organized. For example, if you took a set of 3x5 cards, and if you wrote one letter of the alphabet on each and every card, and then if you shuffled them up, and if you said, now I want to drop them from an airplane at 5,000 feet, and I'm going to see if they will land on the ground in order. And so at 5,000 feet, you throw those cards out of the airplane. And what happens by the time they hit the ground? They're disorganized. They're chaotic. Isn't that right? Here's what the evolutionist says. Given enough time, anything is possible. The problem is you haven't given it enough time. So, all right, let's go from 5,000 feet to 10,000 feet. Now what happens to those cards? Are they even more organized or are they even more disorganized? Now they're even more disorganized. What if you go to 30,000 feet? Now you're lucky if you can even find them. Because given more time, things do not become more organized, they become less organized. That's what's observable in nature. Now everybody look up here. Everybody listen. Do you see those things on the screen? That's what's observable in nature. Number one, the origin of life. What's observable in nature is that there had to have been a designer because the designs are so intricate. The laws of biogenesis, that only life can produce life. That's what's observable in a laboratory, and there's never been a case. Every once in a while, they'll put some chemicals in a test tube, and then they'll come up with something that resembles life, and they'll say, we did it! We've created life in a test tube. And I like the illustration that I heard Adrian Rogers give. He said, suppose you had a beautiful mansion that a man built, and then his son came along later and said, oh yeah, watch what I can do. So his son begins to tear a few boards out of that mansion. He goes out in the backyard and builds a shack and says, voila, look what I created. And I did it on my own. He says, just because you can take something from the previous creation and build something that is less complex and less attractive and less functional doesn't mean that the mansion and the man that built it does not exist. Does that shack prove that the builder of the mansion does not exist? No, here's what they do. They take a few chemicals that God has created. They put them in a test tube. They make something that resembles life and says, oh, no need for God, we did it. It's like the old joke about the guy that was the scientist that had an audience with God, and God said to the scientist, you think you're so smart. He said, watch what I can do. And God picked up a bunch of mud and He formed a man out of that mud and He breathed life into that man and voila! God said, there, that's what I can do. And the scientist said, oh yeah? Watch what I can do. And the scientist knelt down to get some mud and God said, whoa, wait, stop. Get your own mud. The fixity of the species, isn't that what's observable in the laboratory and in the natural world? The law of entropy, the entire model of evolution flies in the face of the law of entropy. So let me ask you a question. I said earlier that when it comes to the matter of origins, we all believe what we believe by faith based on the evidence. We look at the evidence and we make a faith-based decision based on the evidence. So let me ask you, where do you feel the evidence leads? Where do you think the evidence leads? Is the evidence in favor of what the Word of God says, or is the evidence in favor of what the evolutionary scientist is saying? Everything that is observable and repeatable is in favor of what the Bible says, and yet they tell us that we're not scientific. I want to share with you an article. I don't have it on the screen. I just want to read it to you. I want you to listen. A leading biologist with the Human Genome Project was being interviewed. I want to read to you how this interview went. Listen. The interviewer said, do you believe the information in the human genome evolved? Biologist. Nobody in my profession believes it evolved. Did you catch that? Nobody in my profession believes it evolved. It was engineered by genius beyond genius. Such information could not have been written any other way. The paper and ink did not write the book. Knowing what I know, it is ridiculous to think otherwise. Interviewer. By the way, the only way that he would give this interview was on the basis of anonymity. Interviewer. Have you ever stated that publicly? Biologist. No. I just say that it evolved. To be a molecular biologist requires one to hold two insanities at all times. One, it would be insane to believe in evolution when you can see the truth for yourself. Two, it would be insane to say you don't believe in evolution. All government work, research grants, papers, big college lectures, everything would stop. I'd be put out of a job or neglected, or relegated to the outer fringes while I couldn't earn a decent living. Interviewer. I hate to say it, but that sounds intellectually dishonest. Biologist. The work I do in genetic research is honorable. We will find a cure for many of mankind's worst diseases. But in the meantime, we have to live with the elephant in the living room. Interviewer. What is the elephant? Biologist. Creation design. It's like an elephant in the living room. It moves around. It takes up an enormous amount of space. Bumps into us. Knocks things over. Eats a ton of hay. Smells like an elephant. And yet we have to swear it's not there. And so, no study on creation would have been complete without at least touching on the subject of evolution. And so I wanted to share that with you tonight. And I hope you realize, look this way, don't turn me off just yet. Just one or two more sentences I want to wrap this up. Folks, listen. Evolution is not good science. You don't have to reject it for theological reasons, although there are good theological reasons for rejecting it. But many, many, many scientists that you would not consider to be religious men are questioning everything they've ever learned about evolution. I'm talking about renowned scientists, well-known scientists, because everything that they're seeing tells them it could not have happened. And so, let me tell you why it's so important that we understand this. If you don't start right, you don't end right. And if you're not right, if you're not grounded in Genesis 1 and 2, your worldview is going to be skewed for the rest of Scripture. This is the most important subject concerning a biblical worldview. Genesis 1 and 2. That's why it is so attacked by Satan. Because Satan knows that if he can get a young person especially to question God and the honesty of God and the authority of God in Genesis 1 and 2, then what possible reason would we have for believing the rest of Scripture? This is the reason that we have to give our young people reasons to believe. This is the reason we have to teach them these things. And this is the reason that we have to approach it not just from a theological perspective, but from a scientific perspective, so that our young people not only know what they believe, but why they believe it. So let's bow for prayer, and this is where we'll pick up next week.